Here are 3 books that changed my financial life. These are 3 books that before I read them, I was dirt poor, $80,000 in debt. I was working minimum wage job at a climbing gym out in California. And after having read these over the last 12 years, been able to amass multiple millions of dollars. And in a large way, we can thank these 3 books. And here's what's interesting about these 3 books is I bet you have never had these recommended to you in a video like this, especially book number 3. But let's go ahead and put that one aside for just a minute. Book number 1, The Intelligent Investor by Ben Graham. Now, I am not recommending this book to you for the reasons you think I am. It says The Intelligent Investor. And if you know anything about investing history, Benjamin Graham is the godfather of value investing. He also happens to be the mentor and teacher of the great Warren Buffett. There's a very famous story of Warren Buffett wanting to go and learn from Benjamin Graham. This was like, I don't even know. I would have to guess it was probably like in the 40s, 50s or so. Warren is a young buck. He's in his 20s, hasn't done anything with his life yet. And he goes and he says to Benjamin Graham, who is like the legend of investing at that time, he says, I want to work for you. I will work for you for free. And Benjamin Graham looks at Warren and says, even at free, you're overpriced. Even for free, you're overpriced. And this would be Warren Buffett, the man who would go on to be the wealthiest man in the world. So that should give you a little bit of humility to how you approach your own life and the value that you think that you can add to people who are further along the journey than you if you want to get into the same room with your mentors. But here's the thing. I read this book because it's been recommended, and it's a foundational text of investing. I actually do not recommend that you read this book. And I'll tell you why. In reading this book, what I came to learn was that treating investing as the way to make your money, to be a investor, a professional investor where you are doing as Warren does or as Benjamin did, and you are trying to make investments, you're trying to place capital in the stock market for the purposes of building wealth, it's obscenely difficult. It's obscenely difficult. And in fact, for most people, 99.9% of people, instead of taking your time and energy trying to learn how to invest in the ways that Warren Buffett and these billionaires do, you would be better served going and learning skills that will allow you to make money, skills of communication, of sales, of entrepreneurship, of psychology, these skills that can be used to increase your earning potential. And then you take that money and you invest it, as Warren Buffett suggests for the majority of people, into index funds or into, passive real estate investments or into securities, right? This book, what it taught me was that this was not the way I was going to get rich. And it freed me up from having to worry about trying to learn all the ins and outs and the nuances of investing theory. And instead, I just focused all my time in acquiring skills that would help me make more money. So I do not recommend that you read this book. It's an interesting book. A lot of it's outdated at this point as well. But the big lesson that I took from this was that I don't need this. This is too much. It's too complicated, and it's too complicated for most people. Next book. You're not going to see this one coming. This one has made me a lot of money. My dad gave me this book for, I think it was my 16th birthday. And it was very confusing to me because I did not particularly have any strong affection for this author. He wasn't somebody that I was like a fanatic about or anything like that. And it was on a subject that I wasn't even particularly interested in. So I was very confused. The book is On Writing by Stephen King. Stephen King is known obviously for writing horror novels and, science fiction and all fantasy and all that stuff. And he's great. And I liked him as a kid. I read some of his stuff, but I wasn't like, I'm a Stephen King fanatic or anything like that. And so when my dad gave me this book that Stephen King wrote about his writing process, it's part biography and it's part writing mechanics. Stephen sharing his process for writing his books. I was really confused by it. It wasn't a book I was looking for as a 16-year-old. But a number of years before that, my dad had noticed that I had this innate ability to tell stories and communicate through the written word. And he started to foster it from a very young age. When I was like 12, he would pay me 10 cents per word to write him short stories. So obviously, if I'm getting paid per word as like a young kid, my theory is let's make that thing really wordy, right? So I threw every adverb you could find into these stories, and they're absolutely terrible. But he would pay me 10 cents per word to write him these short stories, and then he would have me sign over the rights of the story to him. And he kept telling me, he's like, I'm going to keep this because one day you're going to be famous. And I want to be able to say that I had the first Anthony Vicino story. It was very strange, and I just went through the motions with him at that time because he seemed to like it, and I wanted him to be proud of me, and it seemed like a good way to make money, so I was doing that. And then when I was 16, he gave me this book, and then I went to college, and I got these degrees in psychology, religion, and English, but then I got out of school, and I still didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. And it never occurred to me that writing was going to play any kind of meaningful role in it. And so I left college, I went off, I became a professional rock climber for a number of years. And my life imploded when I was 28 years old. And I've told this story so many times at this point, but my fiance, she dumped me, and I got kicked out of the house, and I was dirt poor. I had $80,000 of debt. I had no skills. I was working, a professional rock climber sounds cool, but I was dirt broke. And I didn't know what to do with my life. And at that time I was like, well, what can I do to support myself? I want to make money. I don't want to be here in this place anymore. And, the thing that came to mind was writing. And I started writing and thinking, I'll be the next Stephen King. My dad thinks that I have a skill as a writer. I'll go and do this thing. And this book, lo and behold, all these years later, 12 years later, I've used the lessons in this to write 13 best-selling books. And like the videos that you see here, a lot of them are scripted. That comes from writing. And I think writing is one of the most powerful skills anybody can develop. And the great gift in my life from a financial perspective is that my dad somehow, some way saw that this was going to make a meaningful impact on my life. And he fostered that skill from a very early age. But in a very real way, this book on writing, I've made millions of dollars because of the skills that I've learned as a writer and how to communicate my ideas. And so this book on writing by Stephen King, absolutely pivotal. And I highly recommend this regardless of where you are on your journey. Now, the third book, and you will not have seen this one coming. This will not have been on anybody's radar. It's a science fiction book that, most people will never have read. And I do not recommend that you necessarily go and read it. So let me rewind for a second. I told the story of, my fiance kicking me out, and then I started writing. That's not exactly what happened. I'd actually started writing a year before that. I started writing a year before that because over Christmas the year before, I went home and I asked the girl who had gone to be my fiance, I went and talked to her parents and asked for their permission to marry their daughter. And they sat me down in their living room, and her mom was this kind of, type A personality, CEO of a big corporation type, no nonsense kind of lady. And she looks at me at that point in my life and she said, this wasn't a rhetorical question. This wasn't a softball question that she was hoping I would smash out of the park. It was a genuine question. She looked me in the eyes and she said, what are you going to do to provide for our daughter? And at that time I was, in the climbing gym. And I remember thinking it was the first time in my life where the reality of my financial situation was, it was abundantly clear that I wasn't the only one affected by it. Right before I could kind of go through the motions and whatever, I lived credit card to credit card, and I was the only one negatively affected by it. But now society had this expectation that I was going to provide for another person, for right or wrong. And I left that conversation thinking, what can I do to make money? And it was actually at that point that I decided, oh, my dad thinks I can write Stephen King, and I made a decision that I was going to be the next Stephen King. And so the very next day, I sat down and wrote 3,000 words. And I did that every single day for the next year. And by the end of that year, about 18 months later, so it would have been 1 year from that day that I started writing, 6 months after that, which would have been about 6 months after my fiance kicked me to the curb, I published this book. And the thing is, when I started my window washing business, in the back of that van, it was largely so that I could support my writing long enough that I could become a famous writer. But writing takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy. And there's no guarantee that you're going to become wealthy with it. And one of the quirks of life is that while I was writing these books, and I wrote many of them over the ensuing years, they never really took off in the same way that my other business, like the window washing business did. And so now I'm more known as like entrepreneur and having built successful businesses. But what started it was really, I wanted to be a famous writer. I wanted to be the next Stephen King. And the first book that I wrote then that would have come out, 6 months after I started my first business, and 6 months after my fiance left me and all that stuff, is this book called Time Heist. This is not a great book, but it's the first book. And this changed my financial life. In a very real way, it changed my life entirely. Because the day that I left the day after I left that conversation with her parents, I resolved at that moment that I was no longer just going to be useless to the world, that I was going to develop a skill that people could not look at me and judge me and think like, what does he have to offer? It would be indisputable. And it took a long time. It took a long time for my skills as a writer to earn me any kind of money or notoriety. But who I became in the process of committing to learning a valuable skill, that right there changed my financial life. And so this book, though it's not the greatest book that anybody's ever written by any means, it was the most valuable thing because it was the crucible in which the person I would ultimately become was forged. And so I'm not recommending you go read any of those 3 books necessarily. Stephen King's On Writing is a great book. I do actually recommend that one. I'm not saying you go pick up Time Heist. I'm not saying you go pick up Intelligent Investor. But those are but sometimes the books that have the biggest impact on our lives have impacts on our lives for reasons completely unrelated to the words on the page. And I wanted to share that with you guys because sometimes, you see the same books recycled in these types of videos over and over and over. And I wanted to share maybe 3 that were off the beaten path that had very profound effects on my life, despite the fact that the words actually in the pages, I couldn't tell you anything about them. I can't really tell you anything about what I read in Stephen King's book other than that it inspired me and it gave me confidence that I could do that too. I can't tell you anything about what's in Time Heist. There's nothing in there that's going to change your life. And yet, like, when I hold this book and I'm able to like see it on the shelf or I see it next to any of the other books that I've written, like it's the confidence to know that I can do anything that I set my mind to. Or The Intelligent Investor just being the paradigm shift that I needed to say like, oh, that's actually not what I want to do at all. And so I encourage you to reflect on what are those books in your own life, because if you're watching this type of video, I'm guessing you've read more books than you really need to have read at this point. And a lot of those books probably didn't have much of a positive impact on your life unless you stop and reflect on why that might have been. And then you take those lessons and you apply them. But I wanted to share that with you guys. Hopefully you got a little bit of value out of this. If not, then we'll try again in the next video. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow.